Transgressive acts are those which break societal norms and boundaries, and transgressive art seeks to provoke people and to challenge society in ways that we would not normally be allowed to do, or perhaps even think to do. While there have been many pieces of transgressive still art, such as Mark Quinn's piece called Self and Damien Hirst's Mother and Child Divided, there have also been plenty of live performance artists that can be seen as transgressive. Many live artists take on a feminist outlook, challenging patriarchal structures and strict gender binaries, while often involving some level of politicism too, using their own body as a canvas or medium. The first example of transgressive art is by Marina Abramovich, who performed one of her most well-known pieces of art called Rhythm Zero in an art gallery in Naples in 1974. She wanted to test the limits of collective human behaviour and her own endurance. Here is a clip of Abramovich talking about the piece.
On the table was a rose, perfume, piece of bread and grapes and wine, and then was objects like really scissors and nails and a metal bar, and finally was also a pistol with one bullet. So basically the audience wanted to put a bullet into a pistol and kill me. And I really want to take this risk. I want to know what is the public about and what they're going to do in this kind of situation. It was a really difficult piece because I just stood there in the front of that table, and in the beginning nothing really happened. Public would come, they would play with me, they would give me a rose, they would kiss me, look at me, and then public became more and more wild. They cut my neck and drink my blood. They carry me around, put me on the table, open my legs and put a knife between. The one person took the pistol, put the bullet, and see if I would really with my own hand push the target. The galleries came and completely go crazy, take this gun out of his hand, throw out of the window. They took a scissor, they cut my clothes, they put rose pins into my body.
The piece lasted 6 hours, after which Abramovich was able to move. Interestingly, once the time was up, the audience quickly fled, ashamed at how carried away they had got and how transgressive they had acted. This piece of art was transgressive since it explored the subjugation of women and showed how often they are objectified in potentially deadly ways. In a similar vein of challenging patriarchy and misogyny, Carolee Schneemann performed at first to an all-female audience in 1975 with her piece Interior Scroll. As part of her performance, she pulled a thin scroll out of her vagina. When she read the scroll aloud, she recounted her interaction with a sexist male filmmaker and publicly shared her experiences of misogyny, personal feelings of inadequacy, and the intimacy of her body. Since she identified common fears, concerns, and experiences that other female viewers had, there is a sense of unity and empowerment where before there had been a feeling of isolation that patriarchy had imposed on them. Pulling the scroll out of her body symbolised how Schneemann was cleansing her body of anger in front of a supportive audience. These pieces of art are seen as transgressive in how confrontational and explicit they are, and how they challenge part of society that many don't question. Feminist artists such as Abramovich and Schneemann often use these methods to challenge patriarchal views and to highlight how women's bodies are so often not their own. Other performance art which could be seen as transgressive is burlesque, or more specifically neo-burlesque, which unlike the traditional form is performed by both men and women. First emerging throughout the 90s and 2000s, neo-burlesque looked to evaluate second-wave feminist anti-porn debates which were seen as exclusionist, normative and anti-sex, and also the commodification of the female body through modern raunch culture. Key aspects of this art form are low production value, deliberate amateurism and a focus on failure of self. Judith Butler looked at how we perform gender and states that humans are so great at performing what we think gender should be that it almost becomes real in itself. That's to say that while gender doesn't exist, our performance of it gives it the appearance of existing. She argues that people who do not perform well are often othered and outcasted from society, and only people who perform correctly pass as what people say is their correct gender. Jackie Wilson, author of The Happy Stripper, makes an important distinction between traditional burlesque and neo-burlesque. She argues that traditional burlesque cannot be transgressive in the same way as neo-burlesque, since it fits so perfectly into sexually submissive stereotypes of the ideal woman. However, neo-burlesque performers directly address the audience in confrontational ways, use irony and parody to challenge double standards and reinforce feminist agency. Freud talks about how art is a way for humans to translate our transgressive thoughts without acting them out in real life, which is why pieces of still art can be seen as provocative, transgressive, and controversial. However, I would argue that live art in many cases can be seen as more transgressive, since the canvas of these art pieces are human. This means while the artists may be in character and not in real life situation, they are still recognisably human, acting in transgressive ways. Furthermore, while both traditional and neo-styles of burlesque can be seen as transgressive for breaking sexual boundaries, I would argue that neo-burlesque is even more transgressive, since not only does it break sexual boundaries, it also challenges huge patriarchal structures and gender norms by showing just how ridiculous these are through the bad or failed performance of them. The last form of performance art that this video will cover, which can be seen as transgressive, is drag. Since drag has become part of the mainstream since the rise of reality TV show RuPaul's Drag Race, it has arguably become commodified, with it being more about the spectacle and less about what it's helped represent in the past. However, for many queer people, the art form itself is still hugely transgressive by challenging the strict binary gender norms and roles that we in the West have. Roop et al. Argue that there is a controversy about the political and social messages that are embedded in drag performances. Likewise, Bridges suggests that drag queens in particular actually reinforce binary gender norms, asserting cis male privilege and ultimately strengthening gender stereotypes. In contrast, I would agree with Khan et al., who state that drag acts to resist hegemonic masculinity by parodying and transgressing gender expectations and highlighting the performative nature of gender. Grief did a study which found that drag can be transgressive in the way it highlights a flaw in society's perception of gender. While Judith Butler did not say that real-life gender performativity is something that we can just take off and change at will, drag does highlight how strict gender boundaries are by how transgressive drag is perceived, and challenges these strict roles and show how fragile they are. I would offer two critiques of grief. First, while it could be said that many mainstream drag queens perpetuate female stereotypes, there are drag performers who are bigger and transgress against the boundary of beauty standards, which says that women need to be a certain size. Likewise, drag queens can appear to be outspoken and vocal about social and political issues, which subverts the idea that women should be quiet and passive within society. This can be seen as transgressing social norms and helping to deconstruct stereotypes of how women are expected to perform within society. Nally states that some drag acts are more genderqueer and challenge gender binaries by perhaps wearing a wig, makeup and a dress, but showing more typically masculine features such as hairy chests and hairy armpits. Secondly, I would critique grief by arguing that while drag queens can follow female stereotypes, this is where the much overlooked drag kings are useful in carrying out this transgression against gender stereotypes, as it is women who are escaping and challenging heteronormative expectations by performing in a more masculine manner. This shows that people who identify as female do not need to adhere to the strict binary of being feminine. To conclude, each of the performance art forms that this video has covered shows how art can be used to transgress social boundaries, norms and expectations. Art is instrumental in challenging patriarchal views, as artists such as Abramovich and Schneemann did, pushing against the social structure that oppresses women, causing them to be disadvantaged. Similarly, neo-burlesque and drag are shown to be transgressive in how they challenge gender expectations, provoking the audience to question these rigid binaries and expose how fragile they really are, through performing gender incorrectly.